Okay, I think we can basically get started. So just before we kick off the discussion, just so that everybody knows, this session is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear on camera, please just turn off your video. Yeah, so I just want to start briefly by introducing myself. I'm Gerrit Skaafsma. I'm from the University of Amsterdam. I'm working on my PhD on civil disobedience and climate change. And my co-organizer today is Fabian. And he's also at the University of Amsterdam, and he's working on his PhD, which is about statistical methods and tipping points. Okay, and he's about to defend his PhD, and I'll be behind him by a couple of months. So our guest tonight is Holly Jean Buck. She teaches courses on climate justice and the energy transition and has written two fantastic books. Her first book, After Geoengineering, takes a look at the different ways at which climate restoration might take place. However, today we are here to discuss her new book, Ending Fossil Fuels: Why Net Zero is Not Enough. This book is an attempt to think through in a very careful way what the energy future might look like and the role that social and political movements might play in bringing about a more just climate future. So we're very grateful to have you here today, Holly, and it's amazing that we can discuss your book with you directly. So we've agreed that Holly's going to start with a short introduction to the text, and then I've prepared a couple of questions that I'm going to discuss with her, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the larger audience. So if you have questions, please get them ready, and also you can post them in the chat, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. All right. Holly, over to you.
Hi, it's so great to be here. And I'm looking forward to this discussion session and learning from all of you, as I understand you're all probably working on ending fossil fuels in your own practices and daily lives. But I'll just do like a very quick introduction to this book. I'll share my screen now, but the screen sharing needs to be enabled by the host. And so this book is available from Verso. It came out at the very end of 2011. So, 2021. Time has been moving strangely since then. And this was it's just some context for the book. Verso asked if I would write a short book about net zero. I said I'd be happy to do that, but it transitioned into more than just about being net zero, but really the phase out of fossil fuels. Yet it's still supposed to be a very short book. And I imagine that there would be a lot of books about the topic of ending fossil fuels, given that it's widely understood that this is what we need to do. But curiously, there still are not. So I thought, well, I'll do something in that direction, and hopefully there'll be a whole bunch more rigorous books from all sorts of fields coming out about this. At least that's my wish. And, you know, Verso and myself were motivated to tackle this net zero discourse because it really came up all around the world, as you're familiar with net zero. And I think part of it is an artifact about, you know, we think about this generally as a wedge type of problem, mitigation and climate action. And so there's these different things you can do to reach net zero in these different sectors. This is a figure from the IEA. So like it's well understood sort of what would need to be done to reach net zero. And yet we still aren't really on that path yet. And net zero, you know, it hides this, to me, I mean, I think it's fair to say hides this fact that you're still having some amount of remaining emissions. It's just that they're being balanced by negative emissions. So this figure, for example, from the Royal Society, this would be a kind of 2-degree scenario. You have emissions dropping very rapidly. So it is still an ambitious thing, you know, picture going on. You have this moment towards the end of the century of where it tips into being net negative. So this part at the bottom, this green part, is this carbon removal infrastructure that's being built out to the point where this world is able to remove more carbon than is being produced. And another thing about this figure is that a lot of what that carbon removal is doing is compensating from other greenhouse gas emissions. So CO2 emissions get pretty close to zero, but methane, for example, from agriculture, also N2O, those other greenhouse gases, it's envisioned that carbon removal would compensate for that. And that's kind of the net zero picture. So a lot of challenges with that. It doesn't really tell you what's going on in terms of some of these flows, what's going on with carbon dioxide utilization. So you can imagine that there could be a net zero world where there's a lot of residual emissions and a lot of compensation by these negative emissions infrastructures. And net zero is kind of this permanent state where there's still fossil fuels going on, but we have this massive carbon removal infrastructure. And so, you know, one image is from the CDR primer that kind of maps out where carbon removal could happen. That's an open source resource that's interesting to read, cdrprimer.org. Then the other is just kind of a visualization of what a direct air capture facility might look like at scale. So right now, these technologies to remove these massive amounts of carbon are still mainly in the demonstration stages. But you could have that net zero world and it would be ostensibly net zero, but you could also have a net zero world which is actually ending fossil fuels. And so net zero is this temporary state that we kind of cross through sometime this century, and then we reach kind of a full phase out by 2100. And that's been not really sketched out in detail, right? Because right now we have net zero as the focus rather than this full phase out post-carbon, post-extractive society. And we have, you know, information that's good information that I'm glad people have put together, like the production gap report that shows us, you know, the path we might need to be on and where things are. But we really need more analysis describing what kind of a permanent full zero might be. You could also imagine a net zero world where fossil fuel companies pivot to petrochemicals and continue to extract and produce and are focusing on that, which is not something, unfortunately, that this book I wrote takes up. But if I had written a longer book, this is kind of the piece that's missing that I encourage you all to continue researching and thinking about. It's this feedstock issue. So basically, net zero is not a good enough vocabulary. We can be thinking more about regenerative or post-extractive or, you know, beyond carbon, other frames, full phase out. I think it would be interesting to discuss what you think the best target and framing should be. But basically, if we did have this frame that was post-extractive, for example, that would produce a different world. It would produce different policies, a different material infrastructures than just net zero or emissions would as the focus. And so this is probably familiar to you, but we do have this unburnable carbon. We know about if we wanted to keep within a safe carbon budget, we need to leave these fuels unextracted and really reach peak production now and decline. So another thing about the phase out of fossil fuels, it's not just about the climate impacts, it's about all of these other things that need to be a broader part of the conversation. And so in the book, you know, we discuss a little bit about public health, about how fossil fuels are blocking innovation and other energy technologies, the ways fossil fuels are entangled with corruption and oppression. We can also think about phasing out fossil fuels as an insurance policy to make it more likely that we reach our goals. We need to think more about the materials transition or the land use transition or this kind of multi-transition broadly. And there's a very rational argument that we need to plan phase out because the financial system might be destabilized by the volatility of fossil fuels in a warming world. And what happens when we have this unmanaged decline. So a lot of challenges ahead. Right now, you know, 80% of energy is still from coal, oil, and gas. So massive material transition, but I think the benefits outweigh the risks and challenges with this. And what the book puts forward is 5 different lenses for thinking about phase out, which I will touch on very briefly. But I wanted to bring up first this paper and idea about the mid-transition. So this is more recent, kind of after writing the book, which I recommend checking out, by Emily Grubert and Sarah Hastings Simon. And so they talk about the mid-transition as this period in which the energy supply is constrained by this goal of reducing emissions. And we have these fossil carbon emitting systems and zero carbon systems. They're both large enough that they are imposing constraints on each other, and neither of them can fully support the energy needs on its own. And it's kind of this time that requires more attention and more planning, because as the fossil fuel system is shrinking, there's a question about like what's the minimum viable scale for, like, for example, the gas infrastructure in homes. If enough customers are lost, that can't be maintained. What do? You could have different sorts of energy shortages on different scales. Those could reduce support for the transition. Obviously, there's a lot of labor considerations that right now in the US, we're still mostly talking about in terms of power plant workers or miners, but there's other sorts of people along the supply chain to think about. Same thing with agriculture and the agricultural transition. And so, I just wanted to throw in something more recent as something we also need to think with in terms of this mid-transition. At the same time, we're thinking about this full transition by the end of the century. But back to these 5 lenses, one of them is infrastructure and kind of the planning of that infrastructure. And there's some good analysis coming up about exactly what plants and power plants, but also industrial facilities need to be transitioned and when. And we have that sort of knowledge. So there's other dimensions to the infrastructure too, but there's like a planning level of this. And I also talk about code or information in terms of planning the transition. There's kind of this idea that everything becomes known, right? So there's this imaginary that we have this planetary computer like Microsoft is talking about, but many companies have their version of this where every sort of carbon flow is tracked. And I mention this because net zero demands that we have this information layer, that we know where all the emissions are coming from. They're mapped. We know where these facilities are. We know kind of where the methane is leaking along our pipelines, et cetera. We have this knowledge of that. And then we have this knowledge of the negative emissions or carbon removals. We're able to measure, how well different ecosystems are taking up carbon, how well these different carbon removal approaches work. And then there's this information architecture that connects the emissions and the removals. So you can look at this in a few different ways. You can look at it and say, it's not possible that we're going to be able to monitor and track all that stuff. And it's yet one more reason why net zero is not the right frame for climate action. But then you can also think, well, it would be good to know some of this stuff, so maybe we should improve it. And there's a lot of different startups really trying to work in this space. But we need to call attention to it in a few different ways. I think both to critique some of the, like, we can use this information layer as a critique for some of the carbon schemes, right? But we could also use it as part of a justice-centered phase out. And I mentioned this not just in terms of removals, that's the example I have up here, but other sorts of energy infrastructure as well. In that, we have demands in the movement for energy democracy, for public ownership of energy infrastructure, and there's a material layer to that. But then there's also a digital layer that I think we should be attentive to, where we think about public ownership of the data that's being produced in all these different endeavors, and the profits from that data. how these platforms are governed. Are they open? Can citizens use them in different ways to understand their world, basically? So the book touches on this. It doesn't go into deep detail. The broader challenge is that we have this kind of sector-based wedge idea of climate action. And, we have things we can do that are aesthetic or attractive or culturally resonant a little bit in these different parts, but it doesn't add up to a full narrative, I think, that's really compelling for everybody about what it would be like to live in this post-carbon, post-extractive future. And I know that probably a lot of you are working on this, and I don't mean to discredit our efforts, but it just, when I go out in the field and talk to people that aren't in the movement, they don't have an impression about what it would be like. It's just kind of this unknown and scary place. So that's the challenge we have. We have cultural practices that are actively against transition, and we need ways of just re-narrating the opportunities for a better world here. So there's a lot we could do, both kind of in telling stories about the eventual place where we want to go to, but also in terms of tackling particular problems that come up in the mid-transition. And we could also use the humanities and different cultural practices in terms too of increasing participation in making decisions about what's going on with transport or buildings or land use, et cetera. Finally, there's a geopolitical lens that we talk about a bit in this book. I mean, right now, a lot of energy production is done by state companies. That presents particular opportunities and challenges. But the call here is that we can't just think about our local level, even though that may be easier to influence. We also have to take kind of a global lens and think about what we can do to support fossil fuel exit in lots of different countries together. And finally, political power is kind of the gap and what we need to make any of this happen. And I look at some of the other phase outs of things that have been attempted. None of them has been totally successful, but there are a few examples that we can look at, particular strategies from attempts to phase out single-use plastics, aerosols, as well as the tobacco industry. Again, each of those has its own challenges and sticking points where it didn't become complete, but there's a few ways to look at the different alliances that happened to make some advances in each of these spaces. And then the third part of the book talks about different policies that could be used, from bans and moratoria and refusals to finance to subsidy reform, schemes about permissions to extract, nationalization, and using fossil fuel assets to put carbon back underground. So none of these options is the best option. Each of them has problems, but probably some forms of all of them will be necessary to assemble together. And so thanks. I look forward to discussing your questions and learning from your ideas and experiences.
Thanks very, very much for that. That was illuminating. The final section on political power is one that's obviously of great interest, I think, to many members in the audience. But I want to start with a question about social relations, right? So you say in the book, you say, well, ending fossil fuel use, it's not only about ending pollution, but it's also about ending relations of domination that fossil fuel technology allows for. So what might an energy system that is not based on relations of domination look like? How might it be possible to bring about this non-domination system or system of non-domination, both at a local or maybe even at a global level?
I actually think this is pretty easy to imagine. I think that the movement for decarbonization has done a really good job with this in terms of thinking both about the kind of distributed networks in the grid, but also thinking about how, I think it'll be like a mix, right? I don't think that we should be thinking about the future energy system as just on one scale of like small scale and distributed. I also think we need more centralized high capital projects like geothermal, perhaps nuclear for clean baseload power. But those centralized high capital projects can be worker owned or community owned, such that the community or region can profit from them. So kind of a mix of that and kind of the solar panel on your building, in your garden, et cetera, mix. And so I think people have done a pretty good job of articulating what that might look like. And I think it has a pretty good amount, at least in the US, of cross-party appeal, like where people tend to oppose renewable energy projects. It's not that they don't want clean energy, or, you know, it's that they don't want some other company from some other region coming in and using their land and taking the power away. At least that's what I hear from people I speak with who are upset about the rapid expansion of solar or wind. So I'm optimistic about, you know, the support for a system that's non-oppressive. I think that there's definitely challenges on the geopolitical level that we've seen in the past year. You know, I think that states are afraid of this, afraid of losing their dominance. There's a way in which we can read the war as being about energy. And so it's going to be a real challenge to think about financing these new energy systems in other countries, that the ones that are currently kind of in Russia's orbit. For example, a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa are skeptical of the West, willing to kind of not take a stand against the war. So what's the US and Europe going to do? Like, we have this cost of financing the transition at home that's politically challenging. Now we need to also make an ask to better support the transition in other countries. I think we have to really link that to security and freedom. And I don't think we're making that link as clearly as we could be yet. So that's the challenging part of this.
Yeah, I mean, what you said about sub-Saharan Africa hits home for me because I'm originally from South Africa, and South Africa still gets more than 80% of its electricity from coal-fired power stations when they're working. So it's a huge difficulty in thinking about how to change a centralized energy system to one that's based on relations that are not based on domination. I have a question for you related to something that's happening at the university at the moment here in Amsterdam. There's an ongoing debate about the financing of research by fossil fuel firms. And so there have been petitions and letters and counter letters about accepting money from firms like Shell. And I am interested to hear your thoughts on the subject. Is there a role for fossil fuel firms in their own phase out in terms of financing research? Or is this just something that doesn't seem like it could be done in a way that doesn't seem like greenwashing?
I mean, I think that the fossil fuel companies are going to be involved in this transition, but I don't think it needs to be through research. I think that in a place like the Netherlands or the US, you can make the case that the state is capable and they should be funding decarbonization research. I think that if you are a scientist in an emerging economy where the state has less capacity to fund research, you might be in a different situation. So I would want to kind of make my answer a bit grounded in the positionalities of the researchers. But right now, we don't have the political power yet to kind of wave a magical wand and dismantle these companies. Hopefully, you know, in 10 years, we might be able to build that if we were strategic. So we have to focus on building that power. But in the meantime, I think, what do we do with these companies then? You know, they are not really investing in in clean energy or in transforming their core business model in the ways that they could be. So whatever leverage we can use to push, them to do their own R&D in that direction, whether that's through boycotts or, shareholder activism or whatever rewards society can give for focusing on the clean energy side. But to boil it down, I don't really see any case for them funding research in countries like the US or the EU.
Yeah, interesting. I have another question that's related to the Netherlands, and it's something that you mentioned in your book as well. So here in the Netherlands, there's been a parliamentary inquiry into the exploitation of the gas fields in the province of Groningen. And basically, the inquiry found that there was just simply too much money to be made, and that state regulators were not sensitive to the risks that were involved because it was simply too lucrative. And it was only after a very long battle and a huge amount of damage and trauma suffered by the people in the province of Groningen that the exploitation of the gas fields was finally sort of started to wind down. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on other places in the world that also have this incredibly lucrative resource, but that perhaps are not as sensitive to public pressure to change their practices, and more autocratic states, for example? How can we think about the struggle for decarbonization in terms of addressing those places? Like you've mentioned that state oil firms are the ones that are still extracting the majority of the fossil fuel reserves that are available. How can we think about the climate movement as exerting some kind of pressure on those actors?
I think that regulatory capture is a problem in every country and probably every industry as well, not just fossil fuels. So some of these challenges we face in governance are much broader, and maybe through making inroads, even with other topics, it will have a follow-on effect in our ability to confront this problem. I think that, there's just some contexts where they're going to be responsive to, other business opportunities is probably going to be the way forward. So if they think they can make more money in producing something else, or if there's really strong disincentives, if the demand is just not there. But I'm curious to hear your all thoughts on that, and also kind of what were the ingredients in even getting to the point where you could have a parliamentary inquiry that surfaced that observation.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are other people in the audience that know that story much better than I do. I've got a final question for you that's directly related to the book. You use the term phase out of fossil fuels throughout the book, and you have a chapter where you explain why you go for this phrase. But could you tell us a little bit more about why you decided to go for phase out rather than something like abolition, right, of fossil fuels? That seems to be more strident and in conveying the message of that the fossil fuel extraction needs to be ended as soon as possible.
Yeah, my editor would have preferred if I had said abolish. So there's a few reasons why I chose something that sounds more boring and technocratic. There's kind of a moral resonance with abolition that I think on one hand is important, because it's important to recognize that the choices we're making with our energy system have moral implications. But also, as a pragmatist, I don't think it's useful to get kind of the broad political power you need to point out that people are committing, moral, immoral acts, especially if they're like within a structure that they don't have much agency over. And so I thought that phase out would be more politically possible to mobilize a broader coalition around. It seems more neutral. I also like that it connotes that it actually is something that will take time. It will take decades. We can't do it overnight. I don't think it erases the urgency to acknowledge it. I think it's kind of makes it more realistic that we can get down to the work of planning it, because there are some sectors that we still need for various reasons that we don't yet have all the mature technologies to decarbonize, that people are doing really interesting things with in terms of R&D on different ways of, producing fertilizer. And, even within 10 years, we could have really big advances, and we have to continually update kind of our assumptions about what's hard to abate or difficult to decarbonize regularly. But we do need to realize that, there is a process here. It's not like you can just say it's abolished and then, it's done. So I also think that the main gap in the book, as I've alluded to, is not talking about petrochemicals or feedstocks, what's everything that's made from oil and gas. And there may be some instances in which a small amount of extraction for making particular compounds or products is worth the trade-offs. So not as a fuel, but as something, right? Or it may be that we can use captured CO2 for those applications and totally substitute them out. The problem is that I don't have an adequate background in chemistry and am not in touch with how all of these technologies are maturing enough to make robust claims there, since it's very fast moving. So that's just something that, I think we should all consider. And in our advocacy, think more about not just fossil fuels, but these other products. And I know a lot of you probably do work on the circular economy in these frameworks, but if we could join that materials transition together with this kind of climate energy conversation better, I think that would be good.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that. I want to open the floor now. If you have a question, please just use the raise hand function or put it in the chat, and then we'll take it from there in turns. Questions?
I mean, in terms of this question about how important do you see nonviolent civil disobedience to our chance of being successful? I think it's huge. I think it's a good portion of how the conversation has changed in the last 5 years you can attribute to this. So the one thing I wonder about sometimes is, if you think about energy and attention as being finite because we only have so many hours in a day, how many hours do we dedicate to that versus dedicate to some things that are also really time intensive, like making a roadmap for your region about how they might phase out fossil fuels in each sector? There's some of these kind of tasks that are also very time and energy intensive. So I don't know how we allocate kind of these human resources within climate action. And I suspect it's also an individual strengths and preferences thing at some point. But that is to say, I see it as being pretty important.
Okay, we'll start with a question from Aaron.
Oh, thanks, Holly. So you were talking very much about the phase out of fossil fuels happening over decades and going out to the end of the century. Obviously, that would be compatible only with a carbon budget that was quite large. I mean, we're not talking about reaching 1.5 if we're going out to the end of the century. So do you see that those lower targets are now out of reach? And if so, I mean, going on to your other interests, you know, should we be looking at something like geoengineering as a way of kind of bridging and avoiding overshoot of these Paris targets that we're trying to supposedly still be holding to? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, well, I should clarify something, that if I talk about something like end of century, it's just that I see a very long tail of getting rid of like the last 10%. So I think that we could do a bulk of that decarbonization right now because we have solar, you know, renewables are cheaper than coal, at least in the US. There's a new study that came out that found that in 99% of places that was the case. So we could do like the most of it right now within the next decade or two, I think. But then we have kind of this long tail of some of these particular industrial applications or aviation, for example. So that aside, I mean, to the main question, I think that most people I talk to who are deeper in the carbon budget conversations than I am understand 1.5 to be out of reach. That doesn't mean that 1.6 or 1.7 won't be reachable. So I'm not sure that even focusing on these temperature targets is the best course, because it hasn't really gotten us where we need to be so far, both the net zero and the temperature targets. I think that it would be fruitful to have a framework that was like, we are measuring and focusing on clean energy scale up. We are measuring and focusing on particular phase down actions like retirements, and look at it that way. It might get us farther than focusing on carbon and temperature targets. That's another conversation to have. I definitely support research on carbon removal. I also think that we need to recognize carbon removal as limited in nature, limited by geography, by the amount of land, by the amount of available energy, that we're also going to need to be using that renewable energy for electrifying everything and for green hydrogen. So we need to be thinking about carbon removal as we don't have infinite amounts of it. We have, a few gigatons. So how do we allocate that? Well, we can't just give those removals to the highest bidder. We have to really save those removals to compensate for things that are genuinely hard to decarbonize. So, if a tech company is coming and buying carbon removals, that's not great, because we need to save that capacity for industry. So this is like a whole framework that policymakers are not really talking about yet. And then for solar geoengineering, my position is that I think we need public international research on it, because otherwise we get private low quality research on it. And it's not clear to me that, or anybody really, that it would be effective, and that, the negative impacts very well might outweigh the positive benefits of it. I just see that as something that we don't have the body of science to answer right now, because all we have are these kind of modeling studies, many of which were done with like earlier generation, pretty simplistic models. So that's my position on that. We could talk a lot more about that, I'm sure.
Thanks very much.
Okay, if you guys want to read up on the debate on solar geoengineering and geoengineering more generally, Holly's got she's written a lot about it, including a kind of debate with Frank Bierman from Utrecht, who's a professor there, and they have a kind of ongoing back and forth on the subject. Troy, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Your use of the word to phase out of fossil fuels, it makes sense that is more neutral and perhaps realistic. But in terms of new fossil fuel projects where they haven't started yet, should abolition perhaps be the correct word we use for those in discussing them and trying to stop them? Thanks.
It's hard to know for sure. It would make sense to me, but I haven't gone out and studied, whether using that language produces a strong counter reaction to people who might have been more willing to at least ignore it if it was like, something more subtle. Like I'm just really worried about the backlash in particular states to some of these ideas, including Western New York, where I live. There's a very live debate. People are very worried about what New York State is doing in terms of, bans on new installations of gas furnaces, for example. And if we come in and say we should abolish these, I think it's right. But does the negative backlash outweigh kind of the clarity and energy we get? It probably is pretty geographically dependent, I would guess.
But just quickly, how is phase out possible if we're extracting more and more?
Yeah, well, no, I think in terms of extraction, I think that, what we need is no more new extraction. I think it's very easy to defend that in the US or in Europe. I think it's a bit more challenging to think through it in sub-Saharan Africa. But clearly, that's what we need to do.
Okay, question from Elodie.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot for the talk. I was wondering, because you mentioned, so the book was published in 2021, and I was wondering how, the energy crisis that has been happening in the last year, and like the increased talk about energy security, and even in the Netherlands, like this has been kind of used to explain why we need new permits for gas in the North Sea, like how, and also more recently, the very big profits that show that, it does make a huge amount of money to continue investing in oil and gas, like how you see that affecting maybe more than in 2021, the possibilities for phase outs of fossil fuels?
I think that on one hand, I mean, in some of the book, I think about how this would be like, on one hand, you have, more people nervous about phase out. They want to delay it. It shows the reliance on gas. But on the other hand, you really had this newfound commitment in some countries and some places. Like it was such a clear illustration that it's more than just about climate change. It's about geopolitics. It's about whether you want your money and your production to be supporting the regime in Russia. And people could see quite clearly. And we did have some mobilization towards, investing more in clean energy because of it. So I think we saw developments on both sides. I'm not sure, what the numbers will say in retrospect about the effect it had.
I read recently that the war in Ukraine has maybe sped up the energy transition by 10 years. Some people will quibble with that, but it may be that the short term there's a huge boost, but in the long term it's of benefit in terms of speeding up the transition. I've got a question online from Justinia. She says, many companies rely on carbon offset as one of the main sources of reducing their emissions. What's your view on it?
I mean, I think that offsets have been had so many problems. The record is pretty clear. I think that it's very difficult to prove additionality. I think that instead of offsets, we need to be focusing on permanent removals. The problem is there's not very many companies or projects that are able to offer these permanent removals. So if you're a company that has committed to carbon neutrality, you're now in a bind. I was in a conversation with my university's sustainability office where they're thinking about, their goal to be net zero. But their problem is the flights that, professors and others are taking, right? That's the one part that they can't figure out how to deal with that. And they are not in a position to tell all the professors and administrators and everybody not to fly. So what can they do? They're trying to figure out how to do carbon offsets that are within 60 miles radius so that the benefits are locally felt, which I think is good. Like, I think that there's ways to do offsets that are better than the current practice, but I still think that we need national level policy to be working on creating permanent removals for things that are truly hard to abate.
Okay, another question from the chat from Paul. He asks, how do you feel about what is probably more for Europe at the moment, the 15-minute town and city model, as per that of Carlos Moreno and Hidalgo for Paris? This would mean the reduction of car ownership, allowing the streets to have trees, etc., rather than parking spaces, but has implications for employment and resource use, and of course, our current economic model. I believe that Barcelona has just offered 3 years of free public travel if you give up your car. Yeah, what's your take on this idea of the 15-minute city?
You know, I have to confess I haven't been following this discourse, but how it's described in the chat sounds kind of like a paradise. I mean, I do think that maybe that, you know, it has to be designed in a way that's sensitive for people with all different sorts of abilities, so it's inclusive, but the general concept seems great.
Yeah, I like to think that I live in a sort of 15-minute city here in Amsterdam, and I gotta say it's pretty great. Okay, other questions online? Do I see any hands? Rather quiet audience today. Yes, Fabian.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk and also for the book. I've kind of maybe one comment and then a question, and I want to get your thoughts on this. Currently, there's a lot of debate at the universities of, you know, cutting ties with the fossil industry, and I've had some exchanges with like full professors and so on, where the view is like, well, Shell is needed for the energy transition, and we have to collaborate with them to scale up, I don't know, like hydrogen production and so on and so forth. And to me and some of us here, it seems that Shell is evidently not interested in the energy transition, you know, with the greenwashing, with the record profits, with the downscaling of the climate targets and so on and so forth. And it seems to me there's a kind of a lack of imagination of what would be possible if we had the political power. So for example, we could just tax profits of Shell enormously, with that fund the research, or maybe even try to nationalize it and then really force a downscaling of their business, which they're not doing, you know, out of market interests. So I'm curious on how you see, this process of revoking the social license of Shell and other fossil fuel companies to move into this more radical action space, and whether you see the possibilities there, or like how this kind of, how can we overcome this lack of imagination, and whether you see things like, you know, nationalization actually being on the table, and how we can get to that kind of these more radical proposals that seem to be more in line with what the carbon budgets and the physics of the climate system actually require of us. Thank you.
I mean, I think from my understanding, which is definitely a US-based context, the problem is that you have some departments within universities that are basically funded by the fossil fuel industry. And so it's like a particular geology or petroleum engineering department. And so the fix for that, I think, is not just to say, well, you can't accept funding from them. It's to pressure the institutions like the funders of research, you know, who traditionally don't do research in this space because the fossil fuel companies do it, to think about, okay, what's this new department? And some of them are actually changing their names to be other things, but there's a lot of opportunities, for example, thinking about geothermal, where you're dealing with the subsurface, you're dealing with some of the same practices and, you know, training. Well, can you think about this department not being a petroleum engineering, but like a subsurface something department, you know, and they would think of the right terminology for it, not me. But but it really requires some creative thinking about, you know, because the jobs that are going to change aren't just the power plant jobs. It's like these knowledge production jobs, right? I've seen this really clearly lately. And if you give them a new mission, which they think will be new, more exciting and attract more students and more funding, then they could be on board with it. So I think it's a question for us activists, like, yeah, we can write a petition that says don't accept fossil fuel money. It's harder to say, let's write a petition to make our funding agencies or the university kind of reorganize and rebrand around these other concepts, particularly if we don't, you know, even agree maybe about different sorts of geothermal production. I think that's challenging, but I think that's what we should focus on doing. It might be more effective.
Okay, interesting. Fabian's been involved in letter writing, and and it's a really a live topic at the University of Amsterdam at the moment. So we've got two more questions in the chat. Marta asks, an often heard argument is that national carbon capture and storage is way less efficient, less scalable as compared to CCS research at fossil fuel industries, claiming that nationalizing such effort is delaying it by 10 years. What are your thoughts on how exactly CCS might look?
I mean, in the US, the research has been funded by the US government for 20 years at pretty standard levels. So, I mean, what role do fossil fuel companies really have in carbon capture and storage? They're not the ones who operate the power plants. It's the utilities that receive grants to like outfit their facilities. They have some role in transport, but like those skills about laying a pipe, you know, are not unique to the fossil fuel industry. They're pretty basic. And then in terms of underground injection, obviously they have expertise there, but so does the government, at least here. I'm sorry to keep referring to the US. So I think that I don't really see that the fossil fuel industries have some special, you know, thing that you couldn't hire away, like those people who know how to do those things. I think it's accomplishable.
Yeah, I mean, the knowledge is inside the heads of the people working at these different places, right? I guess they can be rehired in different places. We have another question online in the chat from Mark, which is something that I also think about a lot, about how to balance or manage your career life and family and be actively involved in solving these issues. And like you mentioned in the book, the support that you receive in order that you're able to do this kind of research and write the type of book that you have. Yeah, I would also be very interested to hear how you go about thinking, like, how do I balance my life, my work, my concern about these kinds of things? Yeah.
I mean, something I experiment with now and then is making a time diary. Maybe that's a bit social scientist of me, but thinking, you know, I'm just always surprised about how much time I can waste reading news or things on the internet. And, you know, I'm now using different forms of software to block myself from it so I can focus. So, I mean, I'm not like a time management expert by any means, but I've read many good books about how to free yourself from these distractions, because I think that, you know, we have to start viewing our attention as a resource and not spending that resource on things that aren't worthy of it. And so that's my personal challenge. Maybe some of you have techniques that you've discovered that work for you.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? No further questions. Okay, well then we're basically perfectly on time, 2 minutes before 5, which means I get to say thank you very much, Holly, for joining us here today. It's been fantastic to have you, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, it was great to be able to discuss this book with you, and we very much look forward to whatever you're working on next. I don't know if you can give us a tiny little hint of what the next book might look like, because I think a lot of people would be interested in following up.
No, actually, I've just spent 1 year away from the university working for the US Department of Energy. So it was a heavily bureaucratic experience. I learned a lot about what's going on in terms of policy, but I have to kind of re-energize my imagination now after that experience. So we'll see.
Okay. Well, thanks again, and thank you everybody for joining us. It was great to see so many of you here.